You could look at that through a lens where one grown man taking off another grown man's belt in public to measure a third grown man's head. You could look at that and think that's weird. I can see your point of view there. So what are we going to talk about today, Mr. McKean?
Well, I got a few things on my mind. This is Public Land Week. Your social media feed is probably full of homages to public land and what it brings you. So I thought we might just sort of join that bandwagon a little bit. It is Riddle Run Week for the Glasgow Middle School cross-country team, and I thought I might share a few riddles, including ones like this. What can you catch but never throw?
A cold
fish.
A cold. Yeah, so there might be a few of those today. The question of the week is a 20 gauge versus a 12 gauge. I'm kind of curious where you mates fall on that one, and we might even take additional contributions on that. I don't know. It's a good week. Fall is here.
Let's go. Well, Andrew, what does public land mean to you, Andrew? Start us off.
Well, I'm an American history buff, and there's an idea, kind of a cultural idea of wilderness and how it affects the American psyche. The idea being is this was kind of feeds into the whole westward expansion, manifest destiny sort of idea of American growth and America as a global empire that has as its basis the idea that we aren't done yet growing. We're not done yet expressing ourselves as Americans. So wilderness has kind of always occupied that as an idea. I think public land occupies that idea now. The value to me of public land isn't so much the specific acres and what I do on it. It's the idea of public land, that there is this reservoir that we all own as citizens, where we can do really kind of whatever we want when we want. So whether we actually do it doesn't matter as much as I think that idea unifies us. I think that is such an American idea. It fills me with tremulous pleasure.
Tremulous.
Nice word.
What does public land mean to you? Am I way too just esoteric about it?
Dinger, you go first.
Oh, all right. So I always think it's interesting how tied to what it means to be an American public land is for somebody who lives near public land. And I feel a little differently about public land. I have no less appreciation, I guess, for it, as much as it's just not part of my daily routine as an outdoorsman, or my routine in general, in terms of where I go, simply because I'm an upland bird hunter, and most public land near me in Nebraska is not suited for upland bird hunting. When I think of public land, I think of waterfowl hunting first. And I think of South Dakota's really, really cool program called the CREP program. It's part of a walk-in access program on private land. And it's a fairly modern form of public land or public access. It's not necessarily public land. It's privately owned, but it's accessible for hunting or for camping or walking or trail riding, that kind of thing, depending on the whims of the landowner. But I love that program because in South Dakota, especially in the area where I grew up, where my family's from, up in the northeastern corner of the state, there's tons and tons and tons of this crep ground. And the crep ground is every bit as good as everything else, especially for waterfowl hunting, because it's got puddles in the middle of it, and you can get right up next to the Sand Lake Refuge on crep ground and have a great hunt. What I think is really neat about that is everybody wins. These small towns get some of the vitality that traveling hunters bring to the area. The landowner is making money on, waste ground or on ground that may not otherwise be great for growing crops. And as hunters, we can enjoy the pheasant hunting or the duck hunting or the deer hunting on that land without having to ask permission, without having to pay, just by basically being alive and being a license holder in the state of South Dakota. So that program is probably the private lands program. As a person who lives surrounded by mostly private land and who hunts in places mostly owned privately, those private land public access programs are my favorite thing about the public lands access that I have in my life. How about you, Ryan? What about you?
You know, I felt like I did a whole podcast with Hal Herring here. It probably, when this airs, it'll be a couple weeks out already on the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers podcast. So I felt like I was really, really serious for about an hour talking about public lands on that one, and so I'm going to be a little less serious. And for me, I'm a little nervous that we're starting to turn into cliches on the whole public land issue, and it's really driven by Western organizations that are really focused on public lands because public lands dominate their landscape in the places where they hunt. A lot like you, Eric, I grew up here in the Midwest where public lands are a really important part of some of the things I do. But when I hunt deer, when I'm hunting turkeys, I'm almost always on private ground, and those places are really special to me too. But for me, the big thing to emphasize on the whole issue of public lands is that I think public lands are a really democratic American ideal. That when we look at some of the things that Senator Mike Lee recently said and did, you know, in referring to public lands and national forests as the king's land, the American concept of publicly accessible multi-use lands is completely opposite to what the European model was, where the rich, where the king controlled all the land, and the only people that really had access to the game in the lands were those select few, whereas here in America, the government doesn't own that land. The government manages that land and holds it in trust for all of the citizens. And so I think it's a really democratic concept that's important to us. And, you know, I'm a firm believer that I don't want to live in an America where there aren't wild places. And wild places can exist on private land as well, but I want wild places that any American can get to, where they're aspirational, but where also they're accessible. And so those are the things for me that the recent debate was people have kind of denigrated the right-wing folks that have denigrated public lands as being a socialist concept. I completely disagree with that. And I think anyone who knows me knows I'm a pretty anti-socialist, anti-communist guy. I've been reading books about the Enlightenment and capitalism lately that are completely opposite to that philosophy. But on the other end, I also don't like this trend that I've seen where there's this attitude that if you hunt private land, that you're not as good as me because I do it on public land and therefore I'm superior. I think that's almost becoming a cliche in some segments of the population right now. And I think that's a poll that's not helpful either. I think that there needs to be a balance. But I'm glad that we're having this Public Lands Month and these Public Land Days and that we're celebrating this issue because for my business, for making hunting and fishing products, it's pretty critical to have public lands for us to have a business. And they're an economic driver. We keep seeing more and more data emerging about how outdoor recreation is an economic driver. The Outdoor Industry Association is talking about how outdoor rec is 2% of the gross domestic product now. That, I'm not an economist. I don't know if that's true or not, but I do know that outdoor recreation and the economics built around it are pretty big in a lot of places. Critical to my business, critical to our businesses, for all three of us that are sitting here talking, and they are pretty dependent on having access to places to go on public lands. And so I guess I got a little bit too serious there. Speaking of my anti-cliche things, I working in the wildlife community, one of the cliches that every conference you go to, people do PowerPoints, and they always are strewn with quotes from Aldo Leopold. I made a pledge about 4 or 5 years ago to stop using Leopold quotes because I thought it was a cliche. And it's actually, I think it's made me a better communicator because I have to look harder than just picking up Stan County Almanac to find original ideas. I'm going to start using nothing but McKean quotes in all of my presentations.
Yes. There we go. McKean, you got a quote that we should start using? Just one off the top of your head? Take that as a no.
Did Andrew McKean's phone die?
Oh, there we go. It almost died. Geez, Louise, I was waxing eloquent there, and apparently the only people who heard me, well, was me. I was just going to tell you, Bronson brought this full circle because I actually have an Aldo Leopold riddle. And
Aldo Leopold riddle.
Oh, they called him Old Thigh Slapper back when he was doing his field work in Arizona.
No, they didn't.
Yeah, they did. It was actually they called him Allo Leopold just to have fun a little bit because the Germans just can't stand that. But here's his riddle: what does a panda have that no other animal has? Baby pandas.
Baby pandas. True story.
That's from Dylan of our cross-country team. So I actually want to bring up one other element of public land that I haven't really heard in the public discourse much, and that is it's pretty personal. We're lucky enough to buy a chunk of ground here in eastern Montana, and if you buy a chunk of ground in eastern Montana, depending on the size, there's a pretty good chance it has accompanying the deeded land some sort of public land lease. And we actually have about half of our land mass is a BLM grazing lease. And one of the interesting things about that is, if anything, it has made me value that public land even more. Even though as a leaseholder, a grazing leaseholder, you're kind of you're the custodians of it. It really goes along with your agricultural or livestock grazing operation. There's a fence, pretty good fence that demarks the land, the border between the deeded and the public, but that piece of public ground is accessible through a neighboring block management ground, and there's a legally accessible road that goes along the top of it. I love to see people accessing that public land during hunting season. That's really about the only time anybody besides me or my family accesses it. The interesting thing with it is I really feel a sort of a sense of ownership, even though it is public land. There's a feeling, I think, because we have that custodial relationship with that chunk of public ground, it really grieves me to see people driving across it off of the designated road or in some way abusing it, even more than if it was just a generic piece of public ground elsewhere. And so this goes back to that Mike Lee comment about sort of public land being the king's land, or it's because it's public, nobody particularly respects or cares for it. My experience is exactly the opposite of that. Because it's public, it almost has an even higher, I have a higher regard for it even than some of our deeded land. Anyway, it's just a perspective I haven't heard very often. I would love to hear from other public land leaseholders about their relationship with that too. I feel like I'm doing the public's work by being a good custodian of that public land. And that's a great feeling.
So how many cows do you own?
You just don't ask that in the West.
He's just all hat, no cattle.
I will tell you what
I think that's the right answer, yeah.
You know, if you see a boat filled with people, but it hasn't sunk, you look again and you don't see a single person on the boat. Why is that?
I don't know, Dad. Why is that?
It's because all the people are married.
Oh.
You don't see a single person on the boat. They're all married.
Oh my God!
All day long. I have hundreds of these.
What's the story behind all these excellent riddles? What, a riddle run, you said?
Yeah. So once a year, the middle school cross country team has what we call a riddle run. And the idea is all the kids submit riddles. So these are all, you couldn't tell, these are 6th, 7th, and 8th grade riddles.
Mm-hmm.
I compile them all, and then we divide the team up into groups. And if you answer the riddle correctly, and it can't be your own riddle that you answered, but if you answer a riddle correctly, you don't have to run anymore. So there's a real incentive to be a smarty pants here.
That's brilliant.
Well, I think we now have an explanation for why I'm way overweight.
Well,
I never have to run. I just pipe off smart aleck remarks.
Your head is disproportionately large also.
Well, your head is disproportionately small, and that we know because Eric Dinger measures it every year at SHOT Show, and you're always the smallest head in the room.
I think JJ gets credit for that. He does, however,
JJ?
he takes my belt off every year to do it, which, you could call that weird, I think. You could look at that through a lens where one grown man taking off another grown man's belt in public to measure a third grown man's head, you could look at that and think that's weird. I can see your point of view there, Mr. and Mrs. Listener. I can see why you'd think that's weird. But for some reason in the state of mind we're in, when it's measuring, it doesn't seem that weird. It seems clever and funny. I don't know. You guys were there. What did you think?
Well, we all were wearing temporary tattoos at the same time. I don't know. It's part of that evening's flow.
Mm-hmm. I would say, Dinger,
if only
maybe clever or funny, but maybe not both.
It reminds me of the marketing phrase from Vegas, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, which, nobody, it's not true really anymore, but, there are some things that happen in Vegas. For example, you're at a party late at night putting temporary tattoos on your body, like you probably shouldn't be, or there really is no actual reason to do. Well, I did that. I put one on my leg near the top of my thigh, and, of course, the spirit moves you in moments like that. Some of our listeners probably recall that moment. And I thought nothing of it whatsoever. I scrubbed it really hard the next morning. It wouldn't come off. Totally and completely forgot about it. A couple days later, I'm at home, and I get out of the shower, and my wife looks at me with, the disgust. You guys all know what I'm talking about. The disgust look, you got to be freaking kidding me look. And she catches my eye, and I'm like, what? And she goes, you got to be effing kidding me, and walks away. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, what? What'd I do? And then just then I catch myself in the mirror on the side of the very top of my thigh, which you could construe to be the side of my ass, is a tattoo that I had put on there that evening.
A tattoo of a spider that says Arachnid Sportsman Society. I don't see, we're an elite club dedicated to spider habitat and maintaining spiders at huntable population levels. I think we should be proud of that.
See, I think we should be proud of that.
But what she was balking out at is really the last refuge of an arachnophobe is a tattoo.
Oh, yeah.
Oh. Profound. Hey, speaking of last refuges, do you know the least spoken language in the world? Sign language.
Was that your dad joke that you were kind of nursing?
Yeah, I've been working on that one for since an hour ago, and I'm not impressed with how it came out. I'm actually a little shy to put this out on the internet now.
So, I get every month or maybe it's every other month, I get a copy of Boys Life magazine from the Boy Scouts because of our sponsorship of Boy Scouts, and we advertise there. And in Boys Life, there's a whole section of where Scouts submit jokes. And right now, we haven't told a joke that's any better than the worst joke I've read in Boys Life. Just putting it out there.
Well, wait a minute. I really haven't gotten warmed up yet. So here's Allie. Allie asks this: what question can you never answer yes to? Are you asleep?
I don't know, Ellie. What question? Oh, geez. I don't know. I've probably lied answering that question in a duck blind before. Think that through.
Although then Mason asks this, I think, kind of unanswerable question: what pees in water and poops on land? And I feel like his answer is wrong, but he says it's a frog.
I mean, in Mason's defense, I've never seen a frog poop in the water. I don't know if I've ever seen a frog poop, though, now that I mention it.
I have certainly found tree frog poop on my door sill around my house where I have tree frogs living. There's no water around. I've never seen them urinate, so I can't disprove it at this moment, but I think I could probably go to the Journal of Reptilia and Amphibian Biology and probably find some data that would counter that. But I'm not going to do it. I'm going to say he's right.
Well,
mostly because I want him to stop running.
We all do. Well, Wayne asks this: what has a head, a tail, is brown, but has no legs?
Head, tail, brown, no legs.
I'm still running.
It's a penny.
Huh. Yeah?
Old Stumpin' Lane there, we call him.
All right.
Did that nickname come from the same place that old Al Leopold came from?
Old
knee slapper Leopold.
So as we're recording this, we're about to go into the hearings with Brett Kavanaugh before the Senate, and we're talking about knee slapping and stuff. I don't know if that's good foreshadowing or not. But my question for you, Andrew, is: do you feel like your kids are running a little bit faster now that grizzly bears are back on the endangered species list?
Well, not as fast as they might run if they lived in Gallatin County, Montana, bordering Yellowstone Park.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the thing I would say if I was coaching there is you don't really have to run that fast. You just have to run faster than Sam.
Well, there you go.
True story.
Tell
us, Andrew. Give us your take on that. I mean, you're a Montanan. You know more about this kind of thing than most people. Is it a sad state of affairs? Is it par for the course? What do you think?
So, other news of the week besides the Brett Kavanaugh hearings was the news that a federal judge in Montana returned the delisted Yellowstone grizzly back to the endangered species protection of the federal government. The reason that that's important is, for years and years, the grizzlies in the Yellowstone ecosystem and grizzlies in all of the lower 48 have been protected by the feds. They've been managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, not the states, as their numbers have slowly been building. And one of the interesting things is, back in Montana in the 1970s, there was actually a hunting season for grizzly bears in a couple of units. A couple of friends of mine had tags for the last season. So that's 40 years ago now. Since then, through careful management and a lot of habitat considerations, grizzly bear numbers have been ratcheting upward. I think the statistic I saw was when the hunting season was closed in the Yellowstone ecosystem, there were 130 identified bears. Now there's 770 bears that are known through DNA analysis, and probably a lot more bears that are unidentified. So you could kind of probably guess that there's around 1,000 grizzly bears in that ecosystem. And by every measure, certainly population dynamics, it's been a great success story. And I think I would like to see us celebrate that. Instead, there's been a lot of litigation from people who have a lot of disinterest in having a sanctioned hunt for Yellowstone grizzly bears that sued, convinced this federal judge that there were other considerations that were not looked into, and consequently the hunt was stopped and the bears are returned to federal management. The interesting thing from my standpoint on that is, forget sort of the details of the lawsuit, which is, obviously important for the lawsuit, but from population dynamics, this is not in the best interest of the bears. One of the reasons that there was a lot of local support for a hunting season is these bears are outgrowing their available habitat in kind of the backcountry of the Yellowstone Plateau. They're getting hit by cars on highways. They're getting in trouble with rural subdivisions. They're moving out into agricultural areas where there's not much tolerance for, calf-eating grizzlies. And so I think the last statistic I saw was there's 48 grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem have been killed so far in 2018. By far, the vast majority of those bears have been killed by game managers who are responding to complaints of bears eating calves or goats or chickens. That's evidence that the population is growing beyond the backcountry. The reason I think it's troublesome a little bit is visitation to Yellowstone Park increases 40% every year. Gallatin County, Montana is one of the fastest growing counties in the nation. In fact, Bozeman, Montana is the fastest growing city of its size in the country. The human encroachment around Yellowstone is increasing toward the park. Bear populations are moving out into the human interface. This is an apex predator. They're having trouble kind of getting along with that human interface now. I think it's going to get increasingly problematic there. So to me, having a sanctioned hunting season is one management tool that the states could have to start to keep those bears in check with their habitat. And without that, I think we're going to see a lot more negative interactions of grizzly bears and people, and we're probably going to see a lot more bears needlessly dying because they're outgrowing their home.
Well, I think one of the things you mentioned is an important thing that the general public probably doesn't know, and I base that based on tweets I've seen today about this story, is that 48 bears have died in that jurisdiction in the Yellowstone region this year, and most of them were killed by humans intentionally for management reasons because they were problem bears or other things. Bears are dying. Humans are killing bears. It's just the difference is we're having to pay game managers, whether they're feds or fish, wildlife, and parks, to go and take care of problem bears. That we recently had a tragedy where an outfitter in Wyoming was killed. I mean, so that's the extreme, and we've got plenty of other less extremes where cattle are being killed and things. So bears are being killed, and when people get on their high horse and are happy that a federal judge came in and protected them from hunters, the crazy thing is we were going to have a handful of bears that were potentially going to be taken by hunters who were going to pay for that privilege to do it and follow all of the game laws that exist in the states that we're going to allow hunting, including taking the meat. And the anti-hunting elements or the folks that just support keeping bears on the Endangered Species Act are celebrating that bears were protected. Bears weren't protected. All that happened is the federal government is going to continue to pay for bear management. States are not going to be able to have any authority to give any sort of local control to folks that are experiencing problems, and hunters aren't going to have the opportunity to spend dollars for the opportunity to try to take one of these bears. It's annoying, and what ticked me off particularly is that one of the most fallacious tweets I saw on the topic came from the Wall Street Journal, which is generally a pretty good, middle of the road reporting entity, and they said that bears in Yellowstone National Park protected from a hunt by judge's ruling. Bears were never going to be hunted in Yellowstone National Park. The park is a fragment of the whole ecosystem that we call the Greater Yellowstone, ecosystem. So the bears that were going to be hunted were bears that were living outside of the park on publicly accessible places. So, but the first thing that always happens in any sort of issue like this is the truth doesn't matter. It turns into sound bites. But having lived this issue with wolves in Minnesota for my entire life, where wolves have never been endangered, they've only been threatened, and yet today, Minnesota's wolves are still regulated by the federal government under the Endangered Species Act as threatened, and we're not allowed to hunt them, simply because a federal judge has thrown out the work that the Fish and Wildlife Service has done to delist them, even though every objective measure has been met. It's the Endangered Species Act is severely broken, in my opinion.
What happened? Go ahead, Andrew.
One of the elements of the judge's ruling was that he had said that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service hadn't done a good enough job of looking at genetic connectivity of all these different grizzly bear populations in the West. One of the interesting things about that is local support for grizzly bears is a huge part of their ability to move across the landscape. And one of the things I think the hunting season would have done was give a lot more cultural, economic, and sort of community value to bears moving across the landscape. My concern is sort of the functional effect of the moratorium on the hunt is going to be actually less tolerance for bears moving across the landscape, and so probably more genetic isolation. And it's just that kind of real world perspective I think has been lost in any time that these things get litigated to this level of just death.
Guys, what I worry about is the rigor of the biological community. Let me ask it as a question, because I don't live near grizzlies, and I don't speak to people who study endangered species very often. What happens when, like, our life's work at Powderhook is all about, like, we want to create new hunters, we want to create mentors, we want to get more people outside, and I can imagine I've worked on that for, let's say 10 years. And 10 years into it, all the stuff that I've ever worked on, some judge deems inadequate or inaccurate or wrong or takes away. Like, what happens in the biological community when they have put the work in and they've studied and they believe they're in control of these management decisions, and then something like this happens? Have you ever talked to anybody about, how they feel about that? Does it make them feel like their work is completely marginalized in all facets? Or I'm curious if you have any experience in hearing from people like that.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to a number of mostly state biologists. That's the folks that I work with more of the time, who are frustrated that the biological data that is possible to collect, has been collected, that their best professional judgment is that the species is recovered, is not in danger of going extinct, and that it should be returned to state management and state control. And then it often feels arbitrary and capricious that a judge, since I'm going to use the full legal term, arbitrary and capricious, that a judge comes in and rules that they haven't done their job. And I would say more times it feels like the judge is ruling because you didn't dot the I correctly or cross the T, is what a lot of people feel that they're technicalities. If we're going to get into specious arguments over genetics, we've seen similar things going on with wolves, where, look, biologists always have these arguments over lumping and splitting species, but when you start getting that wound up about the alleles on a certain chromosome, and whether that's whether it varies enough for the species to be sustainable, we don't know. Those are, and I guarantee that the judge didn't know either. Truth of the matter is, bear numbers are strong. They're growing. The habitat is protected in a sufficient breadth and quality that will sustain bears, and that the states have management plans where they're not going to drive them to the endangered species list again by over harvest and things. Those things are all true. Getting hung up on technicalities of a complex ruling, I don't think it does the animals any good. It doesn't do the state wildlife agencies any good. and it certainly doesn't do the public discourse any good.
Hey, let me ask you this, though, Bronson, because you said you thought this was an example of the Endangered Species Act being broken. I guess I look at it as this was an example of the Endangered Species Act working, right? It allowed the population to recover. There was a mechanism to return the management to the states. It seems like the act and its mechanisms is working. It's the ability to litigate it to an ounce of its life that's broken.
Well, I support having an Endangered Species Act that tries to head off extinctions. That is a noble and valuable social value that our society should have. Absolutely. But we've had other species in this country that have been recovered and restored without the benefit of the Endangered Species Act. Look at elk, look at pronghorn, look at deer, look at all of these game species that have been restored from the brink of extinction, and they did it without an Endangered Species Act. So the Endangered Species Act in and of itself does not accomplish what we need to do to protect wildlife. It takes the will of the population of humans to do that. So I don't discount anyone's interest in trying to keep these animal species from going extinct. The problem is that once they get on the endangered species list, it's almost impossible to get them off. We've seen it with wolves, and the only reason wolves in the West aren't in the same predicament that wolves in the Midwest are is because Congress came in and ruled and said they're not endangered, you can't put them back on the list, period. Congress ruled. Well, that's indication that the system is broken. If they set up a set of rules and then they have to come in and change the rules in the West to get wolves off the endangered species list, that the system doesn't work. Because here in Minnesota, where wolves never disappeared, they're still on the list. The injustice of that is just crazy. And as being someone who's had wolves, on my farm and have a big impact on my deer, I've seen it firsthand. I don't hate wolves. I kind of love wolves, but I also want to have a little bit of feeling of control, that I have some sort of influence over what they're doing on the landscape, in the same way that I have the ability to impact my habitat. I can impact my deer populations and things. Right now, completely unempowered. If a wolf were to attack my dog right now, I don't know that I could legally protect it. That's a problem.
Yeah, that is a problem.
Did I go a different direction and not answer your question? I think I might have. But I've been watching a lot of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, and I've noticed politicians never answer the questions they're asked. Might be rubbing off on.
I'm going to give you a chance to salvage yourself a little bit. Answer this. Alive without breath, cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in male, never clinking. What am I? I'll read it again. Alive without breath, cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in male, never clinking.
Well, see, I'm going to let Eric answer, because I know the answer, because I recognize it. That's from Shakespeare. So that was part of Midsummer Night's Dream, I'm pretty sure. So Eric, you go ahead.
And is that true? That's impressive.
No.
You only know that because of the movie, right?
They made a movie about Midsummer Night's Dream?
Oh, okay, got it. I thought you were pulling out Shakespeare. I was like,
I am not Chuck Grassley of this podcast. You will answer the question, sir.
Dodger.
Andrew, I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer.
Well, you're a fish.
I'm a fish. Okay, walk through it again so we can take all the pieces and apply it now that we're thinking fish.
Alive without breath, cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in male, never clinking.
What's all in
I
mail?
think it works.
What's that mean?
Scale mail.
Like chain.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, come on. You
Hey.
never played Dungeons and Dragons? In Dungeons and Dragons, if you could get a +5 against fire set of scale mail dragon armor, you were the bomb.
I have literally no idea what you just said.
Well, that's in Dungeons and Dragons, you could have a 20 charisma, Eric, and maximum hit points. It would be spectacular.
All right, Dana,
Oh.
I'm going to give you a chance to redeem yourself here.
All right. Well,
Are
I'll
you
cap
ready?
off the bear.
This is.
Oh, I thought I was going to get to say one. Let me cap it off first, and then you tell us about Shauna. Because we were talking about bears, I have a bear dad joke, and it's arguably one of the greatest bear jokes of all time. Maybe even one of the greatest dad jokes of all time. Maybe even one of the greatest jokes of all time. What do you call a bear with no ears? A bee.
Okay. All right. So you bring up bear without ears, and I'm thinking bear's ears, and we're going to get into a whole monument debate because that's kind of our deal here. And so I'll admit I got distracted.
Did you not laugh? I laughed out loud.
I chuckled a little bit.
I'm going to tell everybody under 10 in my life that joke today. Fair warning if you're under 10.
So if you're under 10 and you're interested in going turkey hunting, did you know that there are about a dozen states where you're not allowed to use a 410?
I did know that.
Bronson?
I assume that was a rhetorical question, right? Since the listener can't actually answer.
Well, I'm hoping that they're saying, really, is my state one of them? And if it is, how do I get that changed? No,
I'll do it. I'll do it. You ready?
Really,
Go ahead.
Mr. Bronson? Really, Mr. Bronson? I did not know that. Is my state one of those states?
It very well could be.
10-year-olds do not slur like they're cigar smokers.
You want me to try again?
Maybe with
Yes, Mr. Bronson. Tell me where you hid the pea.
The wheels have come off.
So here I am trying to move to a topic that is going to essentially be a commercial for Federal Premium Ammunition. And you guys are driving away all of our listeners. But no,
all of our listeners.
Yeah, now he's a 1920s newsboy.
Yeah.
You sounded like Elmer Fudd's son, and he probably probably didn't even know he had a son.
So Dinger, if you were a newsboy, would you sell both the morning edition and the afternoon edition, or would you be lazy and just sell the afternoon edition?
If I was a newsboy, I would make up a midday edition and have my own and sell that.
You want to control the whole chain, huh?
Yeah.
So, but no, earlier.
410.
So at the beginning of the podcast, Andrew said 12 gauge or 20 gauge, and I think that's as useless of a debate as arguing over the 270 versus the 30-06. But they're a lot of fun, and I've been engaged in those debates a lot. But recently, last year, our company, Federal Premium Ammunition, came out with tungsten super shot in our turkey loads, which is this really, really, really dense tungsten-based shot. It's 18 grams per cubic centimeter compared to lead, which is only 11. And since it's so dense, we're loading our loads with shot that's pretty small. We're going 9 and 10 shot, so really small shot compared to what people have traditionally shot at turkeys, and 4, 5, and 6. The problem is, even though we're making this product that's spectacular, and we can even load it in a 410, and I killed a turkey this year at 35 yards with a 410 in Kansas, and it performed flawlessly. There's a whole bunch of states where it's not currently legal, and so we've been talking to the states trying to get them to change. And for the most part, most people are pretty open to it because The regulations restricting turkey shot were put into place. They went to fine shot because they wanted to encourage people to shoot turkeys in the head, to get them close, to be able to identify whether it was a tom or a hen, and not accidentally shoot it sound in the woods. Those were the reasons that they made restrictions. But when they did it, only lead shot really was on the market. And now that there's tungsten products out there that are even heavier than lead, some of those old regulations that were in place for a good reason really aren't such a good reason anymore. And we're having a lot of success talking to agencies about changing it. But we do occasionally run into roadblocks where, even though you make a really good case about, well, why do you not allow 410s in the state of Nevada, for instance? Everyone in Nevada Wildlife Commission agreed that, yeah, this tungsten load is perfectly great, but we don't think that lead loads would be great, and we don't want to complicate the regulations, so we're not going to allow 28s and 410s. That's what their commission ruled. So moving on. But places like Nebraska, where you live, Dinger, you can't shoot any shot smaller than 7.5 legally today, and that cuts off all of these really super dense products that are on the market. And it's not just our company that builds it. Hand loaders have been loading TSS for a long time, and I suspect some of the ammo companies that we compete with will be getting in that business as well. But right now in the state of Nebraska, if you wanted to go out and shoot a turkey with a 410, that would be legal, but you couldn't do it with number 9 or number 10 shot. And so we're working on that. We've got a whole bunch of Midwestern states that don't allow it. But one of the things we learned is that... Go ahead.
Ryan, before you go on, what's the rationale against it?
Well, some people have got these... you've got your... A 410 with lead number 4 shot does not have a lot of BBs. That's not something that is going to throw a very good pattern. It's not going to be terribly effective. I agree. No, everyone agrees. But so banning 410s and 28s was probably to try to avoid wounding loss, because they wanted to make sure that there was enough pellets in a pattern, that you had a dense pattern that would make headshots effective at killing turkeys. But I think a little bit of it is nanny state, where they're making regulations because they don't trust that their hunters will make the choices that'll be most effective, which I think I disagree with. When you look at the 38 states that do allow 410s and do allow any size shot smaller than number 4s, we're not seeing any problems with wounding loss or anything related from those. In fact, there's a growing group of hunters, led, I would say, by Jason Hart, that are 410 aficionados and are traveling all over the country to every state where 410s are legal and trying to get grand slams with 410s. And they're almost all of them are shooting this number 9 and number 10 shot in TSS. But I think one of the things that with now, tungsten shot is really, really expensive. So I'm not going to try to convince people that it's equivalent to lead in price, because it's not. It costs a lot of money. But if you're hunting turkeys and you're only shooting a couple times a year, we think that's probably something you're going to be interested in. And we actually have some of this TSS shot that we're going to be mixing into Black Cloud this fall as well, to get people to try it out. But the idea that you need a 12 gauge or a 10 gauge to kill turkeys, it isn't true. And in fact, I think if we'd have come out with high velocity steel loads back in the 80s, on par with what we have today, the 10 gauge probably would have died away as a shotgun completely, because you had goose hunters, when the steel shot requirements came in the 90s, that they felt like they couldn't kill a goose without those big howitzer 10 gauges, and modern 12 gauges are pretty spectacular. And as we've developed shotgun shells and shotguns that can handle higher velocities and things, honestly, there's not a lot of birds in America that a 20 gauge is not going to be completely adequate to kill out to 40 yards, in my opinion. And so when Andrew brought up the question 12 gauge or 20 gauge, for me how much gun can you handle carrying? Because it's really the weight of the gun, what it comes down to for me. What do you guys think?
Well, I grew up a 12-gauger. My first gun was when I turned 12, which is interesting because, when I grew up, one of your rationale for shooting a 410 load is to be able to get younger people behind a gun and a load that won't hurt them. And it's semi-foreign to me because at least where I grew up and in my family, you're not allowed to shoot the bigger guns until you're 12, until you can have a hunting license, at least in South Dakota. And so my first shotgun was a 12-gauge, and I remember it just beat the crap out of me, but I loved it because it was what my dad had. It was a, sorry, Ryan, earmuffs, but it was a Winchester 1300. My dad had one, and my grandpa had a Model 10.
I grew up with
all of which, though, like my son will have in his bedroom soon because I'm pilfering my dad's gun safe next time I go home to get my grandpa's gun, his gun, and my old gun to display on my son's wall. That's just forewarning, Dad. Anyway, so I grew up with a 12-gauge thinking that's what you needed for everything. And then I ended up with a Benelli Montefeltro 20-gauge because I met a business goal with my old company, which is a fun story I'll tell you at some point. But, man, I love that 20-gauge. It's lighter. It's easier to swing. So I think I'm going to go with you that the new loads make me feel like just about everything I hunt I can kill with a 20-gauge, and that light, easy swinging gun is nice to have. So I think I'm a 20 guy. And to me, some of as I get older, some of the adventure of it, the sport of it, is to not overkill everything and to not always have the biggest, utensil to do the job. That there is some craft and sportsmanship in it that I didn't have growing up, when it was just if it flies, it dies, and let's go get them kind of attitude. So what about you, McKean? You a 12 or a 20?
Well, now I feel like I need to be a 12 because I'm really not an agreeable person, and I hate to make this a consensus. So I'm going to split the sheets a little bit. I do probably a little more upland bird hunting than I do waterfowl hunting. My gift to myself when I wrote my last book called How to Hunt Everything, which if you don't have it, it should be part of every bookshelf in America.
It's on mine.
On mine.
I decided I was either going to buy a lot of really good whiskey or I was going to buy a really nice shotgun. And I ended up buying a side-by-side Connecticut shotgun company side-by-side in 20-gauge, and it's hard for me to shoot anything else. I love that gun. Mostly it's pheasants and grouse gun. And I tend to shoot 1 ounce 5s in it. That seems to be the sweet load for the 20-gauge load. But when it comes to waterfowl, I still shoot a 12-gauge. I feel I want a little bit more reach. I want a little bit more lead in the air, not lead, non-toxic shot in the air. So here's the other argument for a 12-gauge. And those of you who have dogs in your life may or may not appreciate this. What I noticed is, I actually noticed this last year during dove season. I took my 20-gauge out with my then 9-month-old pup, and I was having a slight bit hard time bringing down some far flying doves with that 20-gauge. And it was kind of frustrating my dog, and it was frustrating me trying to get my dog with some positive experiences early on. I wanted that dog to realize that every time I shot, there was a dead bird at the end. And it was hard to do sometimes at that particular spot. So the next day I went back with my 12-gauge for doves, and whether the doves were flying a little bit closer, I was shooting a little bit better, or I had more payloads, hard to know. But it was a better experience for my dog because I could equate almost every shot with a dead bird. I couldn't do it with a 20-gauge. So I'm going to say it's situational. How's that?
Was that a humble brag right there? Like just buried the fact that you killed almost every dove in an otherwise innocuous story? A humble brag? I don't know. Humble brag.
Well, I think I'm going to go on the record and say that Andrew McKean is a disagreeable asshole. And I'm just going to put it on the podcast right now.
That will be the first time anybody's heard that phrase.
Well, you know what? This is only going to confirm it. I have keys but no lock. I have space but no room. You can enter, but you cannot leave. What am I?
A computer, a typewriter.
Yeah, I'm going to give it to you. I'm a keyboard. Yeah.
Yeah, keyboard.
I
didn't want to use the word
Wow.
key because it said key in the.
All right. Well, there you go.
Bronson, did you just come to this podcast with not a single dad joke or riddle?
Well, no, not.
Is all you bring is biological information?
No, so no, I don't only bring that, but I was hoping that I could tell maybe some more personal stories, like about my wedding. At my wedding, you know, when I got married 14 and a half years ago to my wife, it was so beautiful that even the cake was in tears.
Oh, there it is. Well, there you have it, folks.
You know, I feel like I can't leave on that happy note. And just because you brought up matrimony, I did want to bring up, I guess, kind of a personal thing in my life. And it's hard to talk about, but I'm just trying to get through it by talking it through. And that is about both my marriages and how they ended. The first was, it was traumatic. We were mushroomers, and a lot of what we did together was we would go in the field and pick mushrooms and then come back and eat them. And that's what made it especially hard that my first wife died of mushroom poisoning. And it took me a while to get over, but I finally did, and I met a great, great lady. And we had ourselves, you know, a pretty good run until she died. And it's hard to talk about a little bit. She died of lead poisoning. You know, a lot of people kind of wondered if, you know, what was the connection. And the only thing I can say is she wouldn't eat her mushrooms.
Jeez. So earlier today when Federal Premium basically did that whole advertisement about our new shot, I would like to pull our sponsorship and just know that we do not want to condone this kind of material on a podcast.
Okay, well, back to Brett Kavanaugh hearings.
Honestly, I didn't know where you were going with that. The whole time I was waiting for this incredible punchline. It was just so dark.
There was some deep breathing, like, oh no, is it? What's happening here? Okay.
And it's so dark. Do you want to mention to the folks that you've only been married once and it's to the same woman and that was a joke, just in case they missed it?
And then
wonderful wife who is still with me.
And all of our wives have a number of pulled muscles in their eyes from rolling them about this podcast. So now Andrew might actually be bruised after this podcast airs, but we'll find out.
Well, until then, stay on gravel.